I'd like to welcome all of you to this important and exciting discussion regarding Canada's place in the Middle East and its policies towards the peace process and the Palestinians. I'd like to very briefly review the purpose of this important discussion. About a month ago, the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, which I edit, launched a special issue on the exact same issue that we're talking about tonight, featuring the authors who are speaking tonight, in addition to several other authors, 4 practitioners, policymakers who have worked there, and several academics, those coming from the Middle East, as well as Canadian researchers who have examined various facets of the Palestinian peace process, and all of whom have worked there in various ways, shapes, and forms. So I want to stress that the purpose of this panel is really to examine some of the key findings from this special thematic issue. Now, I should point out that the 2 guest editors for that special issue will be speaking tonight, Jeremy and Wildman and Emma Swan, both of whom put in a lot of effort to get this special issue lined up. It's been about a 2-year process, and I'm pleased to say that the results are outstanding in every way, shape, and form. It's pure happenstance that the issue was launched just prior to the cataclysmic events that unfolded just about a week ago. And we had already anticipated doing a launch of the special issue well in advance. So it is an opportunity to not only review past events, but to, time permitting, examine current issues as well, specifically what's going on in the region, and specifically what Canada can do or should be doing about the conflict there. Now, turning to our presenters, our first speaker will be Dr. Jeremy Wildman. He's a fellow at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. He is a scholar of international relations, Middle East politics, Canadian foreign policy, human security, and foreign aid. At the universities of Exeter, Bath, and Ottawa, he explored in depth the impact of foreign aid interventions on the Palestinians and Canada's relationship with the Middle East. He often provides analysis for outlets like the Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera, and live analysis for outlets like the CBC and CTV. His theoretical experience is complemented by nearly 20 years of experience delivering aid in the Balkans and Middle East, which included setting up a large community and youth development organization in the West Bank city of Nablus. Our second speaker is Emma Swan. She's a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Scholar and a PhD candidate at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her research and published work span the fields of gender and development, Canadian and feminist foreign policy, peace and conflict studies, critical development theory, and civil resistance and social movements with a regional focus on Palestine. Emma's interest in bringing feminist theory into the study and understanding of our world is the common thread that traverses her academic endeavors. She's interested in contributing to conversations, seeking to define and articulate gendered power dynamics, and exploring the role they play in shaping policy and practice. In addition to her academic work, Emma has consulted for development organizations such as Islamic Relief, Oxfam International, and Action Against Hunger. She has recently returned to Canada after spending 2 years based in Ramallah, West Bank, where she conducted ethnographic research for her PhD. Our third speaker, David Viveash, is a retired public servant. He retired in 2008. For most of his 37-year career, he was working at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, now Global Affairs Canada. He served abroad in Zambia, Malaysia, South Africa, and Israel, was Canada's first resident ambassador in Libya, and the Canadian representative to the Palestinian Authority. In Ottawa, Gatineau, Mr. Viveash worked at the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, some of you may remember that organization, and did a number of headquarters assignments at DFATE, now Global Affairs Canada. Following his retirement, Mr. Viveash was part of the Jerusalem Old City Initiative research team based at the University of Windsor. You might know Michael Bell, who was also part of that. He was a fellow at our school. He worked as an independent international affairs consultant as well. His consulting assignments have included project evaluation for the International Development Research Center, Israel West Bank Gaza Field Office Director for the Carter Center and Canadian Field Director for a police training project in Ukraine. Right. That's a very important contribution that Canada is making there through a number of different organizations. Most recently, he taught a political science course at the Okanagan campus of the University of British Columbia. And I will say that our final closing comments will come from Hamid Georgiani. He's the chair of the Middle East Studies program of the Ottawa branch of the Canadian International Council. He'll be closing it off with a few summary comments regarding the discussion today and where we might go for future discussions regarding the current situation and Canada's responsibilities to get engaged in that conflict and contribute to conflict management and conflict resolution there. So without any further delay, I will turn it over to Jeremy to moderate the discussion. However, I do encourage readers, listeners to consult the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal special issue. The discussion today will focus in large part on the findings from that journal. So Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks, David, for the introduction. And I have to say, it's a pleasure seeing everybody in the same boxes with me today. We usually just communicate by email, and quite a number of emails over the last couple of years. So as David said, I just want to emphasize that we really looked at Canada as part of this story. So the Canadian foreign policy toward the occupied Palestinian territory and our relationship with the Palestinians. And overall then the peace process, which does draw in Israel. So we're not looking at recent events or the sort of what is taking place so much in the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel, or the Middle East, but they do factor into our discussions, of course, because that is what Canada's foreign policy is interacting with. So this is physically the journal that David's talking about, and we really encourage you to read it. And it is unique, and it's unique that so little has been written about Canada and the Middle East, because the Middle East has actually played an outsized role in our identity as Canadians, and Canadians don't even really think about it. But just mentioning a couple events that are really important, and Canada's been important at times in the region, I should add too. But when we think of Canada, most Canadians think, and David's produced a lot of literature related to this, when we think of Canada in the world, Canadians still to this day largely think of themselves as a mediator country, a peacemaking country, a defender of human rights, as a liberal actor in support of a liberal international order and supporting multilateral institutions like the United Nations. And a real grounding for this image of Canada, and an image of Canada was a Canada that was not just a British colony, was born in the Middle East, in particular in 1956 in the Suez Crisis, when Lester B. Pearson, our then Secretary of State of External Affairs, foreign minister, the title for foreign minister at the time, helped to find a way for Britain, France, and Israel to abscond from an invasion of Egypt that went really poorly for them in 1956 and led to a strong response from the Soviet Union and the United States and international community. And this really birthed, in many ways, Pearsonianism. It's not the only factor, but it's a major factor. And that has a major impact on our identity as Canadians. Uniquely almost, we as Canadians look at ourselves through a certain place in the world. We can, again, I can't go further into that. I just mentioned briefly that also Canada played a key role as referred to at the time as sort of a midwife to the birth of Israel. Canadians played key roles at the United Nations. In particular, our then Undersecretary of State of External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson, in its establishment through the United Nations system. And for Palestinians, that has a major, Canada then plays a major part in their story, because that leads to what they refer to as the Nakba and the refugee crisis that we know today, through the partition of what was historic Palestine into what was supposed to become a sort of a two-state solution at the time of an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. So we get into this further in the journal. I really encourage you to read the journal. The introduction, we describe that further, and through the different contributing articles in the journal. And we were lucky, as Professor Carmont said, to have actually 5 different former insiders who've been working on Middle East foreign policy at the government of Canada at different points over several decades, back to the 1970s at least, I guess. One of them is my co-panelist, I was going to say doctor, ex-ambassador. Everybody wants to call you a doctor now that you're with us, David. Ex-ambassador David Viveash, who's already now been introduced, and he'll describe his own contribution looking at the Middle East peace process in perspective. Another was Mike Malloy, who served as a Canadian coordinator of the Middle East peace process, was the ambassador of Canada to Jordan, and a founding member of the Multilateral Refugee Working Group and co-director of the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. And although our focus is on the contemporary era in this journal, he provides, it's not an expansive diplomatic history, I should say. He does offer a relevant analysis of the details of an unusual 1956 Palestinian refugee movement to Canada. And he describes important historical events and processes around those refugees that are relevant to this day. As some of you may know, Canada was actually quite engaged in the politics of peace building in the Middle East, particularly on the refugee issue. Canada was actually at one point the gavel holder of the refugee working group within the Middle East peace process. It was potentially the most sensitive element of the peace process, along with topics such as the Jerusalem Old City Initiative that we mentioned, and that Professor Carmont, I think you have, maybe you referenced it offline. We'll get into it separately. Another of our esteemed contributors, Andrew Robinson, serves as the chairperson of the refugee working group. He was also the Director General and Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. He served as at the Canadian diplomatic mission in Beirut during Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. So he has a lot of real life experience on the ground. He describes a bit of those experiences in his piece, but he also describes the extent to which Canada had to alter its foreign policy toward the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 1980s, which was then invariably considered a terrorist organization in Canada, much like Hamas is today. And he also describes Canada's recognition of the Palestinian right to self-determination that took place in 1989. Now, Canada was also under pressure in that period to catch up with its G7 allies and be a constructive peacemaker in the Middle East. And a lot of reports in that era also recommended that to Canada, such as the Stanfield Report in 1980 and Senate Report in 1985. With the advantage of having worked on the Middle East desk during the Harper era, which is, and at the now shuttered Canadian International Development Agency, Professor Ruby Dogger provides she fills an important void related to Canada's role in the economic de-development. And this is a topic popular in the political economy of Palestine development, the economic de-development of the occupied Palestinian territory. We were also lucky to have join us a still active member of the public service, writing though in his own capacity, not on behalf of the government of Canada, pro-academic Dr. Michael Atalla, a senior Middle East analyst at the Privy Council office. He argued in his paper that foreign donors to the Palestinians, including Canada, have played a lead role in shaping and maintaining a turbulent status quo in Israel-Palestine, while propping up global consensus for a near moribund two-state solution that David Viveash will discuss further in his 10 minutes. We also have a number of scholarly contributors of note from the University of Ottawa, Professor Costanza Musu, who teaches the Israel-Palestine course at Ottawa, and Cornell doctoral candidate Amelia Arsenault describe how Canada has articulated and pushed its views of Israel-Palestine at the UN, balancing between sometimes contradictory priorities. They note that Israel-Palestine has long played a central place in Canada's Middle East policy and offer a historical account of Canada's UN voting and foreign policy. Some of our academic contributors have extensive field and humanitarian sector experience too, such as Emma Swan, who will describe her own assessment of Canada's feminist international policy toward Gaza. We also had Dr. Timea Spitka, who's a senior fellow at NIPSIA and a research specialist of human security and children in conflict. She interrogated Canada's image as a normative leader in human rights, human security, and gender versus its tendency to waver on those principles whenever applied to Israel. Dr. Spitka argues that by taking sides, Canada has not helped to promote peace or reduce conflict, but that the best route to security for Israel, and especially Palestinians, is peace and universal human security, and that Canada should re-engage as a constructive peace builder, and it could if it so chose. As guest editors, Emma and I actually chose Dr. Spitka's commentary as our concluding note because it reflected a sort of unifying theme behind the papers from at times very different people with different experiences of how Canadians broadly view their place in the world and how they as contributors think that Canada could contribute to Israel, Palestine, and Middle East peace building. Now, I'm running very short with 1 minute left. I won't get into depth in my article. I'll encourage you to read it. But what I did is I contribute to our broader theme as well of the journal. And in 1 minute, I'll say that starting from 1979 to 2019, I look at the arc in Canadian foreign policy, where at one point, and we see this, I mentioned this with Andrew Robinson's contribution, you see Canada shifting towards a peace, sort of focusing on a role as a more fair-minded peacemaker in the region. And I should say, even if it's fair-minded, we all recognize that Canada is part of the Western camp. But in that period of sort of Pearsonianism, Pearsonian foreign policy, Canada chose to focus on finding some sort of political way to realize Israeli-Palestinian peace. You even had Prime Minister Chrétien at the time go to the region and in 2000 suggest that the Palestinians could declare independence universally if they so chose. That's unthinkable in today's politics. I also look in that arc how much Canada changes in the mid-2000s and focuses just on its bilateral relationship with Israel, a sort of Harperian foreign policy that defines our foreign policy towards Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East today, where we relate more to Israel because it's a Western country and focus on that relationship and support for it. And in many ways, then we see what Dr. Spitka suggests, which is that Canada actually does some harm by reinforcing conflict rather than building peace. So we see this broad shift take place, and we see that also with the advantage of having insiders provide their perspectives. So David, I think we'll switch over to you now, and you can give us a view of the Middle East peace process.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks to Dr. Carmen for the kind introduction and to the co-sponsors of this event today. Thanks as well to you, Jeremy, and to Emma, who were enormously helpful to me in the preparation of this paper. It was a new experience for me, and I wouldn't have got through it, I don't think, without your support and your encouragement. I'm told I've got 7 to 10 minutes. I'll try to provide three minutes each of deep background, a quick overview of my paper, and a few comments on what Canada might do going forward. As was mentioned, my Middle East story started at the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, in October 1991. I just returned from 4 years in South Africa, where Canada played a strong role in the transition to majority rule. We received a confidential memo from DFATE, and more particularly from the director at the time of the Middle East Division, Andrew Robinson, who, as has been mentioned, was the author of another one of our papers in the special edition. He informed us that the Madrid Peace Conference was going to be taking place, and he invited CIDA to consider what we might do in the way of a potential contribution. For me, that turned out to be the beginning of 7 consecutive years of work on the peace process at DFATE and CIDA, and at the Canadian Embassy in Tel Aviv, followed by another 2 years as Canadian representative to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. After my retirement in 2008, I had the pleasure of working with the late Michael Bell, John Bell, and Mike Malloy, as has been mentioned, another one of our special edition authors, on the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. As has been mentioned as well, from 2011 to 2013, I returned to Jerusalem, Ramallah, as the Israel West Bank Gaza representative for the Carter Center, which was an exciting experience as well. As many of you know, the Madrid framework included a bilateral track for negotiations between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and a multilateral track which had working groups on arms control and regional security, environment, refugees, regional economic development, and water resources. According to the letter of invitation, the purpose of the Madrid Peace Conference was to assist the parties to achieve a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace settlement based on United Nations Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. The Israeli MFA website summarized the framework quite well, I thought, in saying that the purpose of the bilateral track is to solve the conflicts of the past. The purpose of the multilateral track is to build the Middle East of the future. Now, a few words about my paper. I was first contacted by Jeremy about submitting a paper in early 2020. President Trump's long-awaited Middle East peace plan was released on the 28th of January. It seemed to be very topical and a good focus for a potential paper. My working title was, "Has President Trump Killed the Middle East Peace Process?" As the research progressed, a few major points emerged. First, before Trump, all US efforts at Middle East peace were firmly rooted in Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. In particular, a two-state solution based on land for peace. While Israeli leaders have often resisted these fundamental principles, US presidents before Trump, specifically Carter, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama, have to varying degrees pushed back. As Israel's longest serving prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has never fully embraced the two-state solution. In Donald Trump, he found a willing partner for a more transactional approach to making peace. Well before Trump's so-called peace plan was released, Trump and Netanyahu were chipping away at the foundations of the established framework. Specifically, in 2017, Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital. In 2019, President Trump recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. Also in 2019, the US State Department reversed course on settlements, concluding that West Bank settlements do not violate international law. When it finally emerged, the so-called deal of the century provided for Israel's annexation of the Jordan Valley and all the West Bank settlements. Responding to strong international condemnation of the proposed annexation, Netanyahu, Trump, and Jared Kushner came up with another self-serving transactional solution. In exchange for putting the annexation on hold, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain agreed to normalize relations with Israel until under the September 2020 Abraham Accords. Further undermining the principle of land for peace, other Muslim states, Sudan, Morocco, were for their own reasons encouraged or cajoled to sign onto the accords. As it happened, the deadline for the final versions of the papers for the special edition came 2 weeks before the US election. My response to the question, has President Trump killed the Middle East peace process, was an unavoidable cop-out. I said, it depends on who wins the election. Now a few words on going forward. Now that we know who won the US election, and in the light of the developments of the past few weeks, my response to my own question has to be, it's too early to tell. Some of President Biden's early steps seem to signal a return to a more traditional approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict, including greater engagement with the Palestinians. There were, however, mixed signals in the Biden administration's response to the latest Israel-Hamas war. Biden himself appears to be torn between his longstanding support for Israel and pressure from within his own party for a more fair-minded, rights-based approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Almost 30 years after Madrid, the basic principles of the established framework are being called into question. Although Biden has reaffirmed his support for the two-state solution, many observers believe that this ship sailed long ago. In its place, there are growing calls for one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, with equal rights for all its citizens. The Madrid-Oslo process and the Trump peace plan had one thing in common. They both attempted to define a vision of the Middle East, of the future, without fully addressing the conflicts of the past. What can Canada do? First and foremost, we need to speak up. To be sure, Israel has a right to self-defense. As respected human rights organizations have recently highlighted, however, Palestinians in Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Israel also have rights which are not being respected. Canada needs to defend these rights. As I noted earlier, Canada played a strong role at the highest level on the South Africa issue. That support continued in the Madrid process, particularly through Canada's leadership of the Refugee Working Group. The events of the past few weeks have once again demonstrated that attempting to manage this conflict is not good enough. Rebuilding Gaza is a good start, but the underlying issues need to be addressed. Canada could work with other partners to promote a more ambitious agenda, one aimed at revitalizing the overall peace process framework. As noted in my paper, Canada made extensive and important track 2 research contributions on the refugee issue and the status of Jerusalem. The groundbreaking work done under the Jerusalem Old City Initiative was intended to prevent the kinds of confrontations we saw earlier this month. The Josie recommendation for interim management of the Old City by a special international regime served as the basis for this element of Prime Minister Olmert's 2008 offer to President Abbas. If Canada and the international community genuinely want a democratic Palestinian state, there's a pressing need for creative thinking on Fatah-Hamas reconciliation. The United States intends to work with the Palestinian Authority on Gaza reconstruction. This will be a challenge, given that the Palestinian Authority has no authority in Gaza. One final thought. In the early glory days of Madrid, Oslo, there was an active dialogue between the Canadian Arab, Jewish, and other interested communities on ways of moving the peace process forward. This might be a good time to try to revive that dialogue with a view to identifying creative Canadian approaches to preventing further conflict in this explosive part of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Emma, I'll let you take over for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers of this panel and also my co-panelists. So what I wanted to do with my time today was to share with you a paper that I wrote shortly after conducting a year-long study, which looked at a women's livelihoods project funded by the Canadian government under the FIAP in the Gaza Strip. So I traveled to Gaza with an expectation to find a mixture of responses and diverse experiences from the nearly 100 participants and beneficiaries that I had the chance to interview. But what I wasn't expecting was this overwhelming message from nearly every single participant that stressed these projects are pointless without an end to the blockade. And if I had more time, I would have loved to been able to share with you some direct quotes from our respondents, but you can trust me in me saying that there was no ambiguity in their message. Yes, some women now had small home gardens, or perhaps in some cases a small bakery, but in their eyes, none of this mattered. What good, they would ask me, is a livelihoods project if there is no economy inside Gaza for me to sell my goods? And if the Israelis prevent me from exporting anything? Or what good is my home garden if there isn't enough or I can't afford any desalinated water? So in short, these recipients were really explaining about the specific Canadian funded project that they were detailing this utter breakdown of Gazan society and of family systems and of social networks as a result of the 15 years of blockade. So this process really got me thinking. It got me thinking about Canada's feminist international assistance policy and what this all means in highly unequal and political contexts, such as Gaza. So let's look at the FIAP first. I think, with his 2015 electoral victory, Justin Trudeau really took Canadian politics by storm in promising that he was going to put this feminist stamp on everything that the government did. And to do this, in part, he announced that Canada would adopt a feminist foreign policy. And I would say the most important or leading document in Canada's new feminist foreign policy is a feminist international assistance policy that was released in 2017. So essentially, I'm calling it the FIAP for short to save time. So the FIAP really outlined how the Liberal government planned to refocus 95% of Canada's international assistance to incorporate feminist principles towards advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And while there's no one feminism, what all feminisms do have in common is this goal, the shared goal of interrogating gendered power disparities and striving towards creating a more equitable, socially, politically, and economically equitable world, I should say, through opposing all forms of oppression and domination. We often hear the personal is political. So this was a mobilization slogan of second wave feminists that sort of reminded us that oppression faced by women in their personal lives is not simply a personal or a private matter. And instead it is a consequence of a systematic or larger systematic form of oppression that are shaped and facilitated and integrally connected to politics. So in other words, political decisions affect the personal lives of women and men. And therefore we can't start to address gender equality or women's empowerment as the FIAP intends to do without getting political. And I think understanding this is key to understanding the foundations of the feminist argument. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let's move back to Gaza. The 15 years of land, sea, and air blockade has translated into full Israeli control over the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza. And this has resulted in a number of different crises. There's a crisis in food security, in healthcare, a crisis in energy, water, and sanitation. And with one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, there's also a livelihoods crisis. And the blockade obviously has horrifying consequences for everybody that lives inside of Gaza. But it's fair to say that given women's subordinate role in society, they are particularly vulnerable to the effects of the blockade. However, in the interviews that I conducted, when asked specifically about these insecurities and about the challenges that they faced in their daily lives, Gazan women overwhelmingly cited the Israeli blockade and military offenses as not only their primary concern, but also as the underlying driver of many of their other insecurities that they face on a daily basis. So clearly, the blockade has a tremendously negative impact on the lives of Gazan women. But for me, herein lies the problem. With Canada's development and humanitarian interventions in Gaza are not met with corresponding efforts to end the blockade and occupation, which are arguably the very drivers and root causes of the insecurities that the FIAP is attempting to address. And instead, the Trudeau Liberals continue to self-identify as one of Canada's closest allies and friends. They continue to protect Israel from criticisms and embarrassments related to their transgressions of human rights and international law by voting against nearly every single resolution put forth at the General Assembly, which aims to protect the rights of Palestinians. They continue to approve the sale of Canadian-made arms and military equipment to the Israeli government. They continue to rubber stamp the import and sales of goods on Canadian shelves that are produced in illegal Israeli settlements without labeling them as such. And they continue to shut down conversations around BDS and Israeli Apartheid Week on Canadian campuses and equate these with anti-Semitism. So ultimately, the Trudeau Liberals continue to dogmatically support Israeli interests and have given them essentially a green light to have the support from Canada, almost categorically so, with no conditions attached and asking for nothing tangible in return. And therefore, in essence, I would argue that as Canadians, we have failed in our diplomacy in that region, and we have also failed on our FIAP. I call this sort of feminism without teeth, or what some scholars have called feminist light. But by using this brand of feminism without teeth, the very insecurities that the FIAP is attempting to address are scrubbed of all of their historical, their contextual, and their political dimensions. And in so doing, I think what is being missed is that the livelihoods crisis in Gaza is not only a result of women not being included in the economy. It is about the destruction of an entire social and economic system by 15 years of blockade. No one is stopping to ask in these projects, how does this livelihood project actually address the root causes of insecurity and inequality in Gaza? Or no one's thinking, why are Gazan women resource poor in the first place? And the answer, I would say, in part, is that Gazans have been locked into what some have called an open air prison for 15 years as a result of a blockade, where they are denied access to crucial tools and farming inputs such as fertilizers, tractors, and seeds. A blockade that radically limits any exports from Gaza, restricts most imports of building materials necessary for building and rebuilding infrastructure, and strips them of work permits and travel permits for employment outside of Gaza. And a blockade that also cuts Gazans off from fishing and denies them access to medical supplies and medical care. So while those sorts of questions and answers are not happening, they remain really crucial, I think, in understanding the experiences of women's lives in the region. And by erasing the drivers of insecurity and political dimensions in Canada's understanding of women's lives in Gaza, so too is the possibility of the necessary political analysis erased. So ultimately, by leaving the political context out of conversations related to gender equality, and thus demonstrating, I think, a reluctance to address the underlying root causes of suffering of Gazan women, this destructive cycle of illegal activity remains intact, as does the guarantee that Gazans are going to continue to be deprived of their human rights, as well as equality and dignity and security. I think that reacting to symptoms rather than the injury itself is not only short-sighted and facilitates the further entrenchment of the blockade, but it's also fundamentally anti-feminist. So I'm going to therefore end with arguing that if the Trudeau Liberals recognize or hope to do more than simply adopt the word feminist into their lexicon, they're going to have to take some political risks, because feminism has never been about appeasing the most powerful. And a truly feminist foreign policy would ensure that decisions take into consideration the larger geopolitical milieu and use all of the soft power in their arsenal to encourage Israel to adhere to international human rights and humanitarian law, as well as the Geneva Conventions, and ending the occupation, the siege, and the blockade. Because if they fail to do so, the lasting effects of their efforts to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in the region will inevitably be eclipsed by the devastating impact of the Israeli blockade. And I'll end there and perhaps move to my conclusions in the Q&A about what we could do differently.
Emma, thank you for that powerful discussion or presentation, I'd say, leading into our discussion. I'm going to note that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom panels, I know we're also familiar about this now in 1 year into the pandemic, but there's a Q&A chat box. We'd like you to ask any questions you have in the Q&A chat box, and then I'll manage them with Hattie, who's in the small box on top of your screen. I just wanted to note, Emma, too, that and it's something David will have experience with before I pick some of the questions, is that we saw this irony, and I get into this in my paper, but we get into it in the journal too. I reflect the journal in my paper, where Canada was very involved politically at one point, and that's when David began his career on this topic in the Madrid process, the Oslo process, the Refugee Working Group, the multilaterals, the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, the Track 2 Ottawa process that is really a response to our first experience with Netanyahu and his efforts to undermine a peace process and to support the settlement movement. And you see this irony where Canada was very engaged politically up to the really a shifting point begins with Paul Martin and really sets into place with Stephen Harper, where Canada then suddenly starts to give a lot of money for development aid and humanitarian aid, but absent of any political pressure on Israel or support for peacemaking, relatively absent. And this has been continued by Trudeau. And that really fits to then your experience in what you described there in Gaza. So as a first question, and I think we might all have comments, I might defer first to David. What role do Canada-US relations play in determining Canada's policy towards Palestine and Israel? So Canada in the world in a nutshell, in a way, right? And David, do you have some thoughts first?
I guess my unfortunate response is the role is overwhelming, and that the steps that we take in the world generally, and especially the steps that we take in the Middle East and in the context of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, we tend to be looking over our shoulders towards Washington all the time. And let's face it, it's 30 years since Madrid in October. It's however many more years since Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. I think there's a serious challenge of leadership here. And at a certain point, we may have to decide whether there aren't other ways to manage the Middle East peace process, and there aren't other potential leadership frameworks within which we can do that.
I would even add with you, David, that it's sometimes Washington, I found in my research, taps us on the shoulder because we do something that's out of line with Washington. We might think recently, actually, how Trudeau took a different position than Donald Trump on Jerusalem and moving the embassy, the US moved its embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which it has a lot of implications when it comes to peace building and the idea that Jerusalem should also be the capital of a Palestinian state, and whether or not there can be a two-state solution, right? Canada actually took almost an oppositional approach to what Donald Trump did, other than, as Emma said, Canada pretty much supporting Israel pretty closely in the Trudeau era, the current Trudeau era. I found, though, at times that Canada took actions that upset American plans for the region, because the United States typically has thought about its relations to the Middle East beyond just Israel and Palestine, but how Israel and Palestine affect American interests in the region, and those are broader interests and those are global interests. So Jimmy Carter, and you mentioned the Carter Center, had an eye on a broader peace process back in the 1970s that influences Madrid and influences Oslo. And at one point, our Prime Minister, Joe Clark, ran on a platform suggesting in 1979 that Canada will move its embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was just 12 years after Israel had conquered it from Jordan was the rule of East Jerusalem at the time. East Jerusalem is a Palestinian city, which we have become very familiar with in the news recently with Sheikh Jarrah, Swan neighborhood. And this led to really a strong response from the Arab world, led by Saudi Arabia, but broadly from the Arab world, that forced Canada to completely, the Joe Clark government, to completely rethink its approach to the Middle East, to realize that, maybe we shouldn't be so, let's say, one-sided in the Israel-Palestine relationship, and actually contributed to Joe Clark's government falling, a minority government falling, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau coming back, and with many implications for Canada too, including having our own constitution. Emma, did you have any thoughts on Canada-US? So, sorry, I should have added that the US was a little bit unhappy with Canada because it was upsetting its broader plans for peace. Because US had just negotiated peace between Egypt and Israel in 1979. And that was part of the broader plan for a Middle East peace process.
That's also
David,
when Michael Bell got involved in the Middle East, he was working with Joe Clark on that very issue.
It's right. He was sent out to with the Honorable Robert Stanfield, who had been a conservative leader, never prime minister, but the conservative leader, losing to Pierre Elliott Trudeau a couple of times, who was sent across the region in 1980 with Michael Bell to find ways for Canada to improve its relations in the region, and coming back with a report that basically said, focus on Israel-Palestine and be more fair-minded, because this is how you're perceived in the region. This is the most important conflict in the region. David, very quickly, do you want to describe very quickly what Madrid is? Because I think a lot of people think about the Middle East, they think about the Oslo peace process, and they don't realize what Madrid is, or even Moscow that happened right after Madrid. Yeah,
well, the Madrid framework was unique in many respects. It had co-sponsors as the soon-to-be short-lived Soviet Union and the United States, and it had co-organizers who were the European Union and Japan. And then they had different names for other players. All of those names were expressly designed to avoid anything that might look like a United Nations process. So we didn't have chairs of working groups, we had gavel holders, and we didn't have people who were responsible for particular themes within each working group. We had shepherds. So there were all of these very interesting names. The major flaw in the Madrid framework, which Oslo corrected, was in terms of Palestinian representation. And in the initial 2 years, there was a Palestinian delegation made up of individuals from the West Bank, Gaza, and the region more broadly. And none of those individuals had any kind of a connection to the PLO. And therefore, the voice of the Palestinian people was not represented in the first 2 years of the Madrid process. To their great credit, the Norwegians, through the Oslo process or through the Oslo breakthrough, put the leadership and the voice of the Palestinian people in the right place in the PLO, and we saw the signing on the White House lawn on September the 13th, 1993. I just note very quickly that I was in Sydney, Nova Scotia on that day, participating in one of the working groups of the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group. We had, Canada was taking the lead on maritime confidence building. We had Israelis and Palestinians there. We all watched together the signing on the White House lawn, and then had an evening at Fort Louisbourg, where with some perhaps excessive quantities of hot buttered rum, people ended up dancing and singing as they watched the signing of on the White House lawn.
Thanks, David. The next question, and Emma, you might get dibs on this, is it possible to find a reconstruction way for Gaza without dealing with Hamas?
Ultimately, in my opinion, no. I think that, I mean, a critique that I hear often, and when I talk about the paper that I just wrote, was around the fact that humanitarian aid is by design should be neutral and should not be political. The whole point of being able to gain access is by depoliticizing humanitarian aid. But I think in response to that, I would say Canada is already politicizing our humanitarian aid by not dealing with Hamas. We're not the Red Cross, we're not, who does the Red Cross deal with when they're working in Gaza? With Hamas. So yeah, I guess the short answer is, in my opinion, no. I think that we need to reconsider our relationship with Hamas.
Could I add to that, Jeremy?
Please, David.
I think one thing we tend to lose sight of is that in 2006, within 2 days of the election that was held in Canada, there was another election in the Palestinian territory. That election was encouraged by George W. Bush. It was funded substantially by the United States. It was part of President Bush's democracy will fix everything approach. And it was all well and good until the wrong team won. And a party affiliated with Hamas won free and fair elections. But for very complicated reasons, that winning party was not allowed to take power and hold power. This all happened as I arrived in, or shortly before I arrived in Ramallah as Canadian representative. For the first year I was there, we couldn't talk to any of the ministers in the government because they were from the party that was affiliated to Hamas. And that situation eventually deteriorated to the point when in June 2007, fighting broke out between Palestinian and Hamas affiliated or related security forces. And Hamas took control of Gaza, and they remain in control to this day. So I often wonder if they had been able to make use of a wonderful Palestinian Legislative Council building to sort out their differences through democratic processes, perhaps things wouldn't have come to this point.
When I was last in Ramallah, right before the pandemic, David, I think the L was falling off the Palestinian Legislative Council building, just to show where we're at when it comes to Palestinian democracy. Yeah, that was interesting because Stephen Harper came to power at the same time as Hamas, right? And it was one of the first, and it was a very resolute move by Harper to become the first country to boycott the Palestinian Authority under Hamas.
And we left the charge cut off aid.
That's right. Canada was at, so as you mentioned, Emma, we been very politicized when it comes to aid, even if we moved away from political peace building to a politicized approach to the region. One question we had is, what about we stop selling weapons to Israel and make this a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East? So I'll answer that very quickly and maybe move to the next one. That we had a big shift take place now in Canadian politics, where the new Democratic Party has actually adopted a policy where Canada would not sell weapons to Israel. And if any of you know the politics of the NDP, this is really a major shift. And you can go back to the 1960s when Tommy Douglas, I almost said Tommy Robinson, Tommy Douglas, I'm from Saskatchewan, Tommy Douglas is a very important person to us in Saskatchewan, was looking to Israel as inspiration for the NDP and healthcare in Canada. So it's a major change on how the NDPs viewed Israel-Palestine. The other political parties, of course, not followed suit. Question specifically for David, based on your recommendations for the Canadian government, the Canadian government is currently falling short on potential interventions. What do you think are the pressures on the Trudeau government that prevent it from taking action?
A short answer would be timidity. It's just we don't want to put our head above the parapet on issues that are very delicate politically in Canada as in many other countries. Bottom line, we need to hold Israel to the same human rights standards that we expect of other countries, and that most Israelis I know expect of themselves. I don't know why it's so difficult. Canada is very good at standing up for religious rights around the world. Canada was very good at opposing the annexation of Crimea. Where were we on the annexation of the West Bank that was under consideration less than a year ago? We're too shy, we're too timid, we're too nice.
Do you think, David, that undermines our credibility? Because this is often a question that's related then to how Canada treats Crimea and West Bank. And I've heard this anonymously with a lot of discussions in various governments, including our own government.
Yeah. Look, unfortunately, the Trudeau government hasn't lived up to the expectations that many of us had for it. When it comes to Israel, Palestine, for whatever reason, Canada is not back.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the same vein, I'll just add to what you said, David, and I agree. I think it's this inertia and this fear of change. The Trudeau government has proven sort of time and again that it can't break from the status quo. There's been a lot of talk and very little substantial change that has come about. And I think that I think it's due to a fear and an unwillingness to withstand criticism. And without criticism, any sort of change is going to be different, particularly in the region that we're talking about. Harper moved the goalposts so far in many regards that that moving them again or even moving them back is inevitably going to be framed by some as being anti-Israel, and which of course it's not, but I think that that doesn't matter, because unless we're willing to articulate why we're making changes and to have those difficult kinds of conversations, we will shy away from any sort of change. And sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, David Professor Carmont has a question to ask.
Well, yeah, no, I want to jump in here because based on the two comments that were just made, this is exactly the point. When a right of center party pushes the agenda to the right of the center, it's very difficult to find that middle ground. The Liberal Party has not been able to locate that middle ground to the extent that I think, given that Harper gutted civil society capacity to engage in complex, protracted conflicts like the one we're talking about today, there's been no reasonable return to building that capacity on the ground. We far too often look to the government to solve problems in which civil society should properly be fully engaged. And Emma's points speak to this exact issue. There's only so much that the government can deliver, but ultimately people on the ground have to be part of that delivery process. Consider this, that the Harper government defunded a major Canadian NGO, Kairos. But what people don't know is that there was another organization funded by IDRC called Mada El Carmel, headed by Nadim Rouhana, who works with the moderate Israeli Jay Rothman, works on the ground. He was defunded by the IDRC under instruction from the Harper government. He took the Harper government to court, sued essentially the Harper government. They settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. That's the extent to which the goalposts had been moved, that people who were interested in peace and stability were essentially disenfranchised from their contributions to the peace process or even dialogue. And this speaks to the broader issue of the failure of the Liberal government to re-engage in diplomacy, whether it's the Middle East or anywhere else. You cannot do diplomacy in Ottawa. You need people abroad. We have far too many senior civil servants working at Global Affairs Canada, not enough boots on the ground, not enough people engaged in these issues. The time will come when Canadians realize that we can make a change with or without the government in power. But we have to have the motivation, we have to have the knowledge, and we have to have the interest in engaging in these complex conflicts. The lack of discussion on these complex issues is only going to contribute to a disinterest in the region. So my question to all three panelists was, what is our current capacity outside Liberal government to engage and make a difference there?
I'll maybe take a lead on that, David, just because I worked with so many scholars on this project, but also my own thesis. When I wrote my thesis, I was in the UK because we couldn't, a lot of people ended up going to the UK who were working with the Middle East politics or the environment in the Harper era, because we felt we couldn't interrogate the issues in Canada. The UK, of course, is also probably the best post-secondary market or research area for the Middle East. But we felt you didn't have the freedom to do that in Canada in universities. And also, I looked at Canadian foreign aid to the occupied Palestinian territory. So I interviewed a lot of aid coordinators in Canada, the really important role between government and the organizations on the ground in the Middle East. And I think everyone but one of the interviewees, even though they were working in the Second Intifada, and having been there in the Second Intifada and dealing with things like, you have to worry if you're going to be shot at, you're going to have to worry about checkpoints. This is a hard place to work. Their entire stories focused on how they were being undercut at home by the Canadian government, worries about their careers, worries about their organizations. Entire organizations like our Human Rights Agency, Rights and Democracy, was shut down over small grants to Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. My own theory, David, is that this gutted a lot of our capacity in the civil society in general, and the rot was starting with this response to Israel-Palestine and Harper's sort of staunch support for the Israelis. I'll let Emma and David take over from me.
I'll defer to Emma.
I was going to say the same thing. I guess, yeah, I think that what's really interesting for me in this last 2 weeks is seeing the nature of conversations that are happening about the region. I feel that they're different than they have been before. I've been working in this area for 15 years or so, and on outside of my academic life, there wasn't a lot of interest, a lot of interest around what I was doing and where I was working. And that's changed. And to me, that's really important. And that's something that's, I think, we see, with all, I think, social justice movements, nothing happens in a vacuum, and everybody sort of builds off of and works with the momentum that other movements create. And I think we see these sort of conversations about power being they're going on. They're sort of conversations around power are entering into the mainstream. And we see this with the Me Too movement, obviously, and with Black Lives Matter, and also with a lot of the Indigenous land rights that are movements that have been happening over the last couple of years. And I think this has propelled these sorts of conversations and opened the eyes of people that perhaps were afraid of touching this region and having opinions about what is going on. And I think that does signal a different type of capacity, perhaps, and maybe this will take a while to see where it goes and for it to come to fruition. But I do think that people are starting to become more aware of what is happening over there, and I think that will trickle up rather than trickle down, as it hasn't been.
David, do you have anything to add to David's question?
I'm sitting out here in British Columbia, so I don't have the same sense of what Ottawa is thinking as I used to. So no, I'll pass.
I'll just add, and this relates to you, there's a lot of past knowledge that has sort of been cut off and ignored that we reached back to in this journal, that has sort of been lost from Global Affairs Canada and our Foreign Service. And this was really in that Harper, like that crackdown I described, also took place in government. You hear a lot of people having their careers undercut because they were attempting to be more fair-minded or follow official Canadian foreign policy toward the Palestinians. And I just very quickly add that there's really a lot of scholars and especially ignored regional talent. That problem we have in Canadian immigration in general, where talent from abroad is not respected like it should be. That could contribute. We just lack institutions and lack funding in Canada right now. I'll go to the next questions. I'm going to try and skip, if you've asked a question, I'm going to try and skip you for now. In favor of people who have not asked a question. There's an anonymous question. How does Trudeau Senior's approach to the Middle East different from Trudeau Junior's? Is there a common thread for past Liberal PMs? I'll very quickly add, if you read my article, I have an anecdote, I don't have time to pull it up, from each prime minister back to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And he was a bit hands-off, and I think David might have something to add, relatively hands-off, but quietly accepted this Stanfield report of being more fair-minded towards the region in the early 1980s. I would say the exception to the rule have been recent Liberal governments, particularly Justin Trudeau. His government looks very different than past Liberal governments, even compared to Pearson. I would say it's basically the same foreign policy as Harper, other than as Emma describes, sort of that branding of feminism without the policy follow through. David, do you feel like there was any differences between Trudeau Senior and Junior?
Jeremy, notwithstanding my appearance, I'm not old enough to remember in any detail Pierre Trudeau's approach on these issues.
Okay, thank you. I don't mean to age you. You were slightly you were coming in a few years later, so I know that there was a lot of discussions and institutional memory at that time that carried over. That's one reason I asked. Kais, I'm going to bring up your question. Do you see a change? Sorry, do you see a change in Canada's policy playing in the shadow of the US without a real deviation from US policies, especially related to the Middle East. So again, the United States and Canada and Middle East, anything to add that might be different than what we spoke about before?
But ideally, one would hope that there's more opportunity for convergence, certainly more opportunity for convergence with Biden in the White House than there was with Trump. The question, and I mentioned earlier, it's too early to tell where Biden is going. The question is, are they prepared to try to resolve this conflict after the fifth war that we've had in 13 years between Hamas and Israel? Are they prepared to try to resolve this, or do they simply want to manage it? And the impression that I get, including watching what Secretary Blinken had to say in the region in the past couple of days, is that the reason they're saying we're going to consolidate the peace is because we're going to consolidate the ceasefire is because their objectives don't go very far beyond that.
They really didn't want to deal with this, David. They wanted to deal with the post-Trump era, COVID, and this has been such a problematic issue for U.S. presidents. They wanted to avoid it, right? And right off the bat, they had to deal with it.
Like pivot to Asia, which Obama was talking about. You know, that's still there on the agenda, and I don't think in his heart of hearts Biden wants to touch this.
No, that's right. In your opinion, is there a difference in media coverage in 2021 as compared to previous years? And I assume in Canada is the question. Anybody dare to answer that question?
I can tell you, in trying to prepare for this event today, I was overwhelmed by the media coverage. That was 2 points, I guess. One, initially, or as it happened, I was overwhelmed by the coverage. The second point is I'm also overwhelmed by the extent to which it dropped out of the news in a very short period of time. I get the New York Times morning brief, and it was full of it in the past few days. You look at today and yesterday and the day before, it's hardly anything.
Yeah.
What? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Emma.
I would agree. I just would add, I think it's connected to what I was saying previously, but I think that what is slightly different this time around is our dependency on where we're getting our coverage from. And I do think that that social media has changed the way that people are understanding the situation, because they're better able to hear the voices of Palestinians, of Gazans. It's very easy now to pick up your phone and you can read and hear and see what is going on. And it makes it, I mean, anytime you have a diversity of coverage is going to be better coverage, I think. And it also just offers, it offers people an opportunity to break outside of the CBC sort of coverage, which, you know, as Jeremy, you had circulated that the article mentioning the human rights report that wasn't covered in the CBC yet. It was a major report talking
Human
about
Rights Watch.
Sorry, thank you.
Human Rights Watch followed up on Bet Salem, one of Israel's main human rights organizations, saying that Israel is an apartheid state, and it didn't get coverage in the CBC.
If I could just pick up on Emma's point about social media. I listened to a podcast the other day with Jeremy Banami from J Street, and he was making the point that people in the United States tend to look at the outside world through the domestic political lens, and that there's been a real uptick in interest in what's going on in the Middle East, because people are looking at it in the context of Me Too and in the context of Black Lives Matter. And that's why we're seeing this noticeable shift towards support for a human rights-based approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I saw a quick headline just yesterday, I think it was, saying that large numbers of young evangelicals have the support amongst young evangelicals for Israel tends to have declined since the events of the past few days.
A dramatic drop, actually, David, and including they now support, I think they support basically young evangelicals in the United States, a Palestinian state. And for those who don't know, Netanyahu in ways has been losing the United States Jewish community, not all of them, but a large chunk who are more oriented towards a social justice and peace approach. Peter Beinart's a very famous case, and has instead sort of relied a bit more on evangelicals, like Harper did in Alberta, actually. This is in Alberta, on the prairies and in Canada. Israel has mattered to evangelical voters in various ways, right? So that's a big shift. I would say something interesting about online is that the sheer amount of articulate, capable, say intersectional, let's fit in that word here, but particularly women, Palestinian women who are speaking up. This is something, 20 years ago, I made a film with MTV when in this series called True Life. It was called, forget what it was called, but it was about Israel and Palestine, and they interviewed Israelis and Palestinians, and we struggled to find Palestinians who could speak in English and describe their own experiences in the West Bank. Now you have, I couldn't keep up on Twitter, and Twitter in particular, the amount of outstanding, very social justice oriented women and young Palestinians talking about a different and better future. Mm-hmm. That was probably, that's probably a more important group than any other right now in Israel and Palestine, because the old parties sort of falling to the side. The old approach in the two-state model is really lost its popularity with that group. They largely argue for human rights and one state now. They have many Jewish allies, I should say, too. Anyways, the next question I'll go to before we're going to switch to Hamid for a short bit. It's what Canada can do, sort of think positively. What kind of specific interventions could Canada take that would combine peace, development, and humanitarian actions?
I guess I'll jump in there with my 2 cents. I think what Canada could do is what I call this dual approach to our interventions in the region, and particularly I'm looking at it through the FIAP lens, which 95% of all of our interventions are through. So, and by a dual approach, I mean they could address the Israeli occupation and blockade in tandem with more technical development and humanitarian interventions. And so the second part they're already doing. We're already involved in a lot of technical development and humanitarian interventions. And so I think essentially what needs to happen is to be underpinning all financial commitments towards gender equality and women's empowerment with the matching commitments to diplomatic pressure to end the occupation and blockade. I mean, I think also, if we're looking at the current administration, they could also heed the advice of Jagmeet Singh and to block arms sales to Israel. I think they could also sort of join countries such as France and other European countries in banning the importation of Israeli goods produced in settlements. And also joining the efforts of the ICRC in urging the government of Israel to lift the blockade and to allow the free movement of people and goods. And lastly, I think that Canada can use its middle power status and its good standing in international institutions such as the ICC to support initiatives put forth by Palestinians and the international community in aiming at ending the blockade.
David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mentioned in my prepared remarks that we received a memo from Andrew Robinson asking what CETA could do to support the Middle East peace process. One of the things that CETA came up with was a dialogue fund, and that dialogue fund supported contacts between Israelis and Palestinians on basically whatever they wanted to talk about, and gave tried to build relationships across the Green Line. That went on for quite a number of years and helped to build knowledge of each other's perspectives. And I think, especially given what we saw happening in some of the mixed cities in Israel, that kind of dialogue is still much needed these days.
I should emphasize, right, we in the media in Canada, like the conventional media, not the social media, there was a sort of a story created that there was a Hamas-Israel war taking place. But actually, that was what that conflagration was part of a broader structural problems, a negative piece, ongoing settlement building. There's no occupied Palestinian territory left that's separate from Israel that can create its own state, right? So diplomats refer to it as a Swiss cheese of cantons that are Palestinian surrounded by Israeli settlements. And also, but what's very concerning is we saw this radical shift. At one point, there was an unprecedented talk that Netanyahu might actually turn to a small, more conservative Palestinian political party in Israel, so Arab Israelis, but Palestinians, to form government. There was even a campaign slogan, Abu Yair, if you understand what that means. Netanyahu's first son is Yair. But that shifted into, as Netanyahu's tried to hold on to power, and I think of Stop the Steal and what happened in the United States, Netanyahu is avoiding he's got corruption charges hanging behind him, and Israel actually charges and jails its leaders. His predecessor went to jail, Ehud Olmert, when you were in the region, David, over corruption. And he's trying to form a government, stay in power, and he really contributed to the violence in Israeli cities between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and even settlers were coming in, and settlers are starting to move into Palestinian neighborhoods in Israel, in the old cities like Haifa, Akka, and this has really led to some scary new violence amongst all the scary violence. And from my perspective, the problem was when Canada just supports Netanyahu no matter what, rather than speaking up in that situation, we actually facilitate violence through silence. And actually we're giving support. So it was even worse. We were facilitating him rather than saying, actually, we need to see respect for human rights and equality in the region. That's one of my own things to add. I'm going to hand over to Hamid. He's going to close us out, and then I think we're going to stay on for a few more questions.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank NEPSIA for inviting Middle East Study Group to this very insightful discussion. And I must add that this is not the first time we are doing a joint event, or we have been invited to an event organized by NEPSIA. I think the most prominent one was the one that we had in 2018. And we jointly invited Mr. Robert Malley to come and talk about the Middle East and provide us with his perspectives. Today, the focus was Canadian foreign policy with respect to Palestine and Israel. And to effect this, our speakers eloquently took us on a journey to describe the context and tell us exactly what is the landscape from their perspectives in the context of Canadian foreign policy, and refer to some of the landmarks such as the Madrid and Oslo and many other aspects of the relationship or the negotiations between Palestine and Israel. The interesting part was some of the keywords that emerged from this discussion. Specifically, there was a talk about reconciliation, and I think it was David who said that at the end of the day, we have to consider some sort of a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas if we are going to resolve some of the issues. And subsequently, Emma was referring to the Canada's foreign policy with emphasis on feminism. And very eloquently, she reminded us that looking at the symptoms is fine and dandy, but eventually we have to start looking at the remedy, or how are we going to treat or address those symptoms. Overall, I think it has been a very good conversation. I recall at this time my colleague and also a prominent member of the Middle East Study Group who has passed away, and who may rest in peace. Michael Bell always used to tell me that anytime you want to discuss about this issue, you have to understand the context. And I think you did a good job in providing us with the context. Of course, there is more to the discussion, And within the Middle East Study Group, what we do is in the era of Cambridge Analytica and the alternative facts and the disinformation which is thrown around, we have a commitment to our members, and that is to provide them with a non-partisan intellectual debate, like what we had today. And to continue on this path, I think we are going to have follow-up meetings, bringing other perspectives in so we can address that whole context and some of the ideas that have been shared today with the audience. Once again, thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to work with Professor David Carman on the follow-up activities pertaining to this. And Jeremy, of course, he's always welcome to come and talk to us. He has spoken about these issues in the past. And we look forward to having a session, not too late, but perhaps in September, dealing with the same issue. Maybe we have different speakers, but we will address this as a follow-up. Professor David Carman, thank you again.
Thank you, Hadi, and Hamid. I want to thank Hadi West, who put the time and effort into organizing this event. Outstanding effort on the part of the iAffairs team. We've hired a number of students, all of whom happen to be Middle East experts. So it seems natural that we will make this a focus of our discussion throughout the summer and into the fall. So looking forward to that. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, David, for hosting us, and Hamid for hosting us as well and letting us speak about the journal. David, especially for, it's not easy putting this together in COVID-19, is it? And I know you're, I don't know, I'm amazed with everything you're producing at the journal and as an individual in this context. Really impressive. Hadi, thank you for supporting us. Thank you to my co-panelists for joining me. I think we're going to stay on for at least 10 more minutes to answer some of the outstanding questions. Thank you for everybody who attended as well. There's a lot of great questions and we're doing our best to get to some of them. We'll get a few more in before we leave. I'll go right into one or two of the that we can have time left to address. Do you think that Canada limited its role in humanitarian aid more than I think the question was meant to be, do you think Canada limited its role to humanitarian aid rather than a political role in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? And I think the person asking the question means today, is Canada focusing more on humanitarian aid and avoiding politics, so to speak?
My short answer to that is yes, in a way, certain politics. I don't think that we're steering clear of politics in general, and I think that's sort of part of what I was stressing in my presentation, is that I feel like we are not neutral in this context and in this conflict. We're not neutral in our policy and in our dealings with both parties, and I think we like to sort of to frame our engagement as a humanitarian or development sort of engagement. But I think, as in some of the examples that I tried to touch on, I think we're playing a political role, even if we're not intending to, in our silence and our one-sided approach is what I should say.
Emma, all aid actors in a conflict situation are political actors, right? We are something we know. So
exactly.
David, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, maybe very quickly. One thing that frustrated me, both in Tel Aviv and in Ramallah, was that Canada didn't do as much in the way of aid with a Canadian flag on it. It became easier to write checks to multilaterals to implement our aid programs, and less sensitive. There was after 9/11, and this is something that I saw during my time in Ramallah from 2006 to 2008. and especially given the results of the election in 2006, even our small projects fund became extremely complicated. We had to vet little organizations and often some corner of the West Bank and get them to sign statements saying that they weren't affiliated with this organization or that organization. And to their credit, some of those organizations said, we're not prepared to fill out those forms. What our political thinking is, what our individual thoughts are on the politics of the situation, that's our affair. And if, in order to get $10,000 from the Canadian rep office in Ramallah, we have to sign all of these statements and pledges and whatnot, we're not going to do it. And I don't blame them.
And I'll even add, David, that when it came, I think there was also some fear after Harper of being associated with a specific program, because we saw a lot of organizations defunded and they were went after, often with advice from an Israeli organization called NGO Monitor, to advising Harper to shut them down. And so there was a lot of fear of then dealing with, I think, specific programs. And there was some anecdotes I received from policymakers in the Harper area. They said that although Harper is to date our biggest donor to the Palestinians, technically, and it would always meet our multilateral pledges, but they would really wait to the last minute. And I understand, I won't say it's for sure the World Food Program, but I know they gave money to the World Food Program. And I heard that not only would they give the money like the last minute, midnight of when you have to meet your pledge, but they might even, I had suggested to me that they would actually the morning after backdate a pledge and say that they met the pledge by the end of the year. I don't know if you'll know, this was speaking to folks involved in Ottawa at the time, but it was a real fear even of dealing with certain multilaterals. Harper also defunded the Refugee Works Agency, right? Or took Canadian funding away at one point. So because that was seen, for similar reasons that Donald Trump did, it was seen as supporting Palestinian right of return and Palestinian refugees. One more question that was maybe we can fit in that's quite critical, I think, of Canada, if I read it right. Israel is always seen as a security partner by the USA and NATO allies to combat any threat in the Middle East. But today the world is shifting. There is not a real threat in the region. A lot has changed since 1948. How can Canada be trusted by Palestinians? So by the Palestinians, can Canada be trusted? Or how effective can Canada be in peacemaking process in Israel-Palestine conflict if we send arms to Israel and bread and butter to Palestine? Thank you. So when we arm Israel and we just only give humanitarian aid to Palestinians. Can Canada be trusted was the question.
I think that's up to Palestinians to decide, but I do think that that's a really important point, and I'm sure you both had many very difficult and interesting conversations when you're in the region with people asking you, why don't you, I remember this one specific conversation and someone is asking, why does your government not think that we deserve our own state? Obviously that's a simplistic overview of what the context is, but that is what the feeling is, the sentiment is in some people in the region, and I definitely don't blame them. So yeah, I think that I don't have an answer to the question at all, but I do think that is something that is really worth considering, is what damage have we done and do we continue to do by being sort of having this hypocrisy in both our policy and also just the blatant one-sidedness of our support.
And it contributes, Emma, to us not winning United States Security Council seats. Even there, it sparked a campaign by Canadian civil society organizations campaigning against Canada, with people like Roger Waters of Pink Floyd and Noam Chomsky suggesting Canada didn't deserve the recent, win its recent Security Council bid, heavily based on its relationship with Palestinians. Not only, but it does harm our image.
Absolutely.
David, do you have any thoughts? You had to really deal with this as a diplomat.
Well, there was a great article that came out last week by Michael Link and Ketty from Amnesty International that referred to diplomatic laryngitis. And looking back on my time in the region, that's not it's not a new affliction. It's something that we had to deal with out of the rep office in Ramallah on a daily basis. I mentioned that for the first year that I was there, which would have been 2006, 2007, we got a lucky break. We didn't get any ministerial visits because there were no ministerial contacts between Canada and the Hamas affiliated government. When those visits resumed and we were invited to put forward a tentative program for a ministerial visit, I put forward ideas like maybe we should go on a little tour of the border wall through Jerusalem and show this to ministers, or maybe we should go and visit refugee camps. I got a pretty quick no to the wall. Refugee camps were okay, especially given Canada's leadership on the refugee issue. So what we did during one minister's visit is we went to a refugee camp that just happened to be next door to the wall. And I don't think I've ever been forgiven for having arranged that part of the program.
Unfortunately, I'm laughing, David, because I know a lot of people really get reprimanded for these little things, and we know at the CBC right now, many of us, that some staff are in revolt over coverage and not being able to use context when talking about Israel-Palestine. It's a real battle taking place within the CBC, and I think I didn't see it. The Intercept was even leaked some of the letters today. The Intercept, the online magazine. We are chatting in the panelist box that. Emma, you have to go, right? We pledged to end at 6:30. I just want to say that we have a lot of questions coming in now that are next in the list, and a lot coming in that really take this more critical role of Canada. And you're seeing this frequently in Canada and Canadian civil society and academia, where people are quite upset with Canada's position. And I think this, I'll just reflect, I think this has a lot to do even with our identity as Canadians, that there are a lot of Canadians who are subscribed to the idea of a more liberal internationalist order and not a more, when I say the Harper approach, that's more based on like a Samuel Huntington bilateral realism of this country I identify with because they're like me, and then the other ones are probably bad. And we're sort of stuck still in that, even with some different trappings from the Trudeau government. And we're seeing, and I deal with this a lot, with just really deep criticisms of Canada. I apologize that we're not going to get into them because Emma does need to go, and I think we all need to go. And thank you again for joining us, and thanks for our really fantastic hosts. Thanks to my co-panelists. I know we could talk for probably days about our experiences, and this also reflects on how undercovered this and the broader Middle East has been in Canada. Thank you.